All right, let's talk about sort of the long view of epic fury, which may or may not be complete. It started on February 28th. As indicated in the thumbnail, Admiral Cooper has described epic fury as a generational military defeat. By the numbers according to CENTCOM, 13,000 sorties flown, 15,000 targets hit. Iranian Navy basically on the bottom. Iranian Air Force destroyed on the ramp. Ballistic missile capacity eliminated by a factor of 50 to 80% depending on your source. I mean, in some ways it's been quite a hard conflict to analyze in terms of getting into the different pretty polarized public narratives from all sides. Because on the one hand, as the CENTCOM commander said, the military picture is pretty one-sided and not terribly surprising. The U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy executed and did pretty well. It's what they do. It's what you'd expect, particularly given that Iran was certainly a near peer. It's not a peer competitor like China, certainly, or indeed Russia. And indeed, Iran, prior to the start of Operation Epic Fury, had its air defense capabilities pretty heavily degraded already, particularly by Israeli forces in October 2024. And then again in Operation Rising Lion, the 12-day war, where Israel essentially kicked the door in, if you like, by taking out the bulk of Iran's long-range defense radars for their S-300 systems, and then spending 12 days really pretty heavily attriting the primary remaining long and indeed a lot of the medium-range Iranian subsequent missile capabilities. Given that the U.S. then went in for the operation to drop MOPs from the B-2s with all of the pretty hefty escort and suppression force packaging that went around those again in 2025, sort of following up that Israeli destruction of a lot of Iran's air defense capability with further destruction and suppression. I don't think any serious analyst was looking at the prospect of large-scale U.S. military intervention in Iran in February as a question of whether the U.S. could establish air superiority or not. That was pretty clear that they would be able to, and the execution was, largely speaking, as professional and successful as you'd expect. The challenge, should we say, is that the U.S. administration did not have a consistent set of political aims going into the war. They were variously stated on successive days and even sometimes on the same day by different spokespeople, whether it was Secretary of Defense Hegseth or the President or Marco Rubio or senior U.S. military commanders. You had various sort of aims cited. Anything from full forcible regime change through to ensuring that the bulk of Iran's offensive capabilities to threaten other bits in the region, ballistic missiles, for example, were destroyed or degraded, through to President Trump repeatedly claiming that this was to prevent them getting a nuclear weapon, that supposedly the Iranians were a couple of weeks away from a nuclear weapon had they not intervened. So very broad and pretty variable, should we say, statements of political intent in terms of the desired outcomes. If the campaign was therefore assessed against, did the U.S. military overmatch the Iranian military? Answer, yes. Did the U.S. military achieve what the U.S. government appears to have wanted to achieve with the military action? The answer is pretty clearly no. Unless you take one of a very small sort of section of a pretty broadly articulated series of aims. Was there regime change? No. There was quite a lot of decapitation, obviously many, but also a significant number of IRGC senior personnel, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, but the regime remains intact. It's still very much in power. Opening the Straits of Hormuz really wasn't an aim stated at the beginning because the Straits of Hormuz were open when the U.S. went in, but that pretty quickly became an aim that was periodically stated and then disavowed and then stated again by the administration. And in terms of degrading the ballistic missile arsenal, there's been a fair amount of degradation, although a lot of it is because Iran has used a lot of it. So the aim for degrading that ballistic missile arsenal would be primarily to avoid it being used. So the fact that they've used several thousand of their ballistic missiles, as well as having a fair number of them hit either on launches or in launch tunnels or facilities that have been successfully struck, that's a partial success at best. The Iranians clearly still retain the capacity to fire significant numbers of ballistic missiles and get them through to targets in Israel throughout the Gulf. So I don't think we can claim that would be a significant success, albeit Iran does have significantly weaker ballistic missile capabilities than it did prior to the start of the war. On the other hand, it's also already done a lot of the damage that those ballistic missiles threaten to do. The same could be said of a lot of the US's prior military leverage against Iran. A lot of the threats that were on the table have now been carried out and have not necessarily been politically decisive. So it's an interesting facet of deterrence negotiations when they then pass across to, for example, ceasefire negotiations once you actually have a conflict. Things that you had previously threatened that could be quite effective from a deterrence or a coercive point of view pre-conflict, once you've done them, no longer have any coercive or deterrent effect because they've already been done. So yeah, there's been an interesting shift in terms of the respective power position of the US and the Iranian regime relative to what they can threaten that the other side seems to care about. The nuclear program has probably been slightly further degraded, but then again, it's difficult to assess that. And of course, the president claimed after the B-2 strikes last year that the Iranian program had been, quote, totally obliterated. Interesting to then try and assess progress in degrading Iran's nuclear capabilities this year as a campaign marker versus what he had claimed last year as a total obliteration of that program. It makes it pretty difficult to assess the administration's performance there. And in terms of the impact on the US military, pretty significant losses actually. Obviously, there's been some significant aircraft losses, F-15E Strike Eagles most notably, as well as an E-3G Sentry AWACS, and damage to a fair number of tankers, KC-135s, plus I think more than 20 Reapers at this point, MQ-9s. Probably more significant is the enormous use of air defense munitions. PAC-3, THEAD, SM-3, SM-6, SM-2 defense missiles, both by the US and also particularly by the Gulf states, who I believe have fired more than 2,000 PAC-3s, for example, on their own. Annual production is somewhere in the region of 600 globally, so very significant consumption. Also a lot of Tomahawks, ATACMS, and JASSMs. The main thing there not being that the US campaign wasn't sustainable for a bit longer than it went on. I don't think the US was forced to stop operations because it was running out of munitions per se, but that those air defense and standoff munitions in particular inventories were far too small for assessed requirements against China in an Indo-Pacific conflict context before the operations against Iran started. So it's more a munitions constraint around significantly depleting stockpiles that were already not good enough for Indo-Pacific contingencies. And also pretty galling for people who've been trying to help with coordinating and making the political justifications for getting the Ukrainians the support that they need to defend themselves against having been blatantly and overtly attacked, where a lot of those munition requests have been denied from the US, particularly in the last 18 months, on the grounds that US stockpiles were too depleted. And therefore, we were talking tens of interceptors, generally speaking, per shipment, or GMLRS, or PRSM, or ATAC-EMS couldn't be passed to Ukraine because, according to the administration, US stockpiles were just too low for their own critical contingencies in the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, none of this could be passed to the Ukrainians, even if the Europeans were paying for it, which we were trying to and still are. And to then see the US and its GCC allies blow orders of magnitude more of those munitions and higher-end munitions in a totally discretionary conflict, with at best mixed outcomes, should we politely say, from a US point of view, is a little galling. So, a mixed bag without trying to detract from the generally extremely professional and very successful operational execution by the US military itself. It just was, in many cases, assigned political aims which weren't really in its gift to deliver, regime change being the most obvious example. One of the big headlines during the early phase of the war was President Trump coming to NATO and saying, hey, you guys need to join in on this thing where we get the strait open. And he was sort of categorically rejected by every NATO country, including the UK. So what is the sentiment about the war there where you are in the UK? It's certainly not positive. Again, not for a second, because European countries are fans of the Iranian regime. None of them are. The UK certainly isn't. We've had UK citizens kidnapped and held in Iran. There's no love lost for the Iranian regime in Europe, as indeed there was no love lost for the Iranian regime from multiple previous administrations. It's not that the desire to quote-unquote do something about the threat that Iran poses and the horrendous regime that's in place, not least as horrendous as it is in terms of the way it treats its own people. It's just that the way that the US administration started the war without consultation of allies at all, and then pretty overtly, in some cases quite literally explicitly, telling European allies that they weren't wanted, weren't needed, and didn't have anything to offer anyway. To then turn around when the incredibly obvious thing that every scenario that has looked at military intervention against the Iranian regime has always looked at the threats to shipping in the Straits of Hormuz as the immediate Iranian response, and indeed primary Iranian response in any one of these scenarios. For this to sort of then prompt a very angry kind of demand from the White House for European nations to come and open the straits. Often phrased, to use President Trump's own words, of we've done the hard bit, we've basically won the war anyway, we just need you to come and open the straits. There's a bit of an almost sense of disbelief in a lot of European capitals, and in the UK as well. Because we know there isn't a military solution to opening the Straits of Hormuz, as the US Navy is also perfectly aware, without invading Iran and occupying essentially its entire western coast, which is a country of 92 million people and extremely mountainous terrain with contested supply lines, and it would be a nightmarish operation to try and mount, which is, I'm sure, the primary reason why the US has not done so. Aside from occupying the whole west coast, there's pretty much no military way of stopping the Iranians putting periodically mines, anti-ship missiles from pop-up concealed positions along their west coast, small boats at night to attack shipping, and they don't need to attack very much. They only need to hit 1 or 2 ships every week or two in order to essentially functionally keep the strait closed. Because merchant seamen, generally speaking, aren't keen to be blown up and burned alive on their ships. They're civilians. There's no reason for them to do so. Shipping companies generally won't take that liability risk anyway. And most insurance premiums, you can get insurance to sail ships through contested waters, but it's incredibly expensive, and it generally makes shipping via that route not economically viable for a lot of companies that are relying on global shipping. And so, just as we saw with a concerted US effort against a much less well-equipped Houthi force of Yemen last year of trying to stop Houthi attacks on shipping, that wasn't fully successful either. So the idea of trying to militarily stop the entire Iranian military from being able to do that, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps more specifically, there isn't really a military solution to that for the US. So for the Europeans, it's not just the way that the ask was phrased, the tone in which it was phrased, which was generally both extremely dismissive, quite aggressive, and also came in a context where we weren't consulted and asked about the operation beforehand, and had we been, would have all said, we don't think this is a good idea. But it's also that there just isn't something we could offer. So, the perception bluntly in almost all European capitals, and it's why you've seen the pretty coherent response despite not being coordinated from all these countries, is that the White House has got itself into a position where there aren't obvious ways out to an outcome they can claim is successful. Because there isn't a military solution easily to reopening the Straits of Hormuz, except accepting Iranian control, which would be a huge source of revenue, a stranglehold over a lot of global energy supplies, and also would be notably a much stronger position for Iran than pre the operation. So politically, that's pretty hard for the White House to accept, but there isn't an obvious military solution. So the way that European capitals viewed that ask was, they don't have a way out. The administration's realized that it's really put itself in a very, very awkward position, and therefore they need somebody else to take the fall, essentially. And so we're trying to pressure a European response that would see us attempt to put ships to escort merchant vessels through the straits, which wouldn't work and would risk hits on European vessels as well, but at which point the administration could say, see, we won the serious war, and these weak Europeans couldn't even escort some ships through a strait of water after we'd done all the fighting. See, look, is once again an example of NATO failing and Europe failing. So I don't think there was certainly any perceived benefit from a European standpoint in responding to that demand. It's also worth noting that European countries have not actually stayed out of this war. They just haven't taken part in direct offensive operations against the Iranian regime. But for example, the UK has allowed the US to use RAF Fairford as a main bomber base, RAF Mildenhall, Lakenheath, so the major USAF bases and the forward bomber base at Fairford for operations against Iran, as long as they are defensive, insofar as they are going after Iranian offensive missile capabilities, for example. So this idea that all the European countries have closed their airspace and bases to US forces is just not true. RAF Fairford is busier than it's been at any point since, I believe, 2003 as part of this, with a lot of B-52 and B-1 sorties going out of there. And of course the Strike Eagle squadrons from Lakenheath, a lot of tankers out of Mildenhall, although a lot of that's been forward based in the Gulf. There's a lot of reach back still. So there is still plenty of use of European bases, and the same in Germany with Ramstein and other airheads there. And the UK and France and quite a number of other countries have sent assets to the Middle East to help defend GCC allies and Israel in some cases, and our own bases out there. So Akrotiri, for example, in Cyprus for the UK. So Typhoons, Rafales, various destroyers and frigates, and ground teams with counter-UAV capabilities. So the RAF regiment, for example, have been cheerfully racking up Shahed kills from various forward base locations in the Middle East. So there have been plenty of military assets sent by European countries to help. It's just that they've been sent to help defend regional allies and indeed US bases in the Middle East, not to take part in offensive operations into Iran. So in the sense that NATO is a defensive alliance, if you want to see it under a NATO umbrella from a defensive point of view, lots of European countries, including particularly the UK and France, have taken part and continue to take part in operations at quite significant scale and at a very considerable cost in munitions and aircraft and ship deployments and things. Obviously, the UK Royal Navy has been exposed pretty cruelly in terms of how much it can deploy. But partly there's a case of choosing to prioritize ongoing NATO commitments in the High North against the Russians, who, remember, are waging an active war in Europe. We've been, for example, doing quite significant anti-submarine operations in the North Sea and the North Atlantic against Russian Akula and undersea cable sabotage submarines over the past month that the Defense Secretary was finally briefing about a few days ago, in fact. And in terms of framing it, as the administration has chosen to do, in particular the most recent few weeks, framing it as, see, this is why NATO is a bad thing. When we needed help, NATO didn't come, and therefore NATO needs to be reevaluated as an alliance for the US, etc. Firstly, the only time that NATO Article 5 collective defense has ever been invoked was by the United States after 9/11. And we then spent 15 years fighting America's wars with it in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of European countries took more casualties per capita than the United States did in those wars. So the only time NATO collective defense has ever been invoked was by the US, and we did come and help. But also, the US didn't invoke Article 5 over this because it wasn't attacked. So NATO was never asked to come and help. There was no US request to NATO, and it would have been assessed as an issue if the US tried to invoke Article 5, which it couldn't because it hasn't been attacked, or Article 4 to try and get a collective defense response. That would have been a different question, but again would be only relevant if the US was attacked because that's what NATO is for. In much the same way as, for example, if the UK hypothetically were to decide to go off and invade Argentina because we claimed that there was some threat to the Falklands imminently, we wouldn't expect NATO to come and help us in that because that's not what it's for. If the French were to go off and invade Mali to try and re-establish presence there, they wouldn't invoke any NATO mutual defense clause because it wouldn't be appropriate or relevant. So again, it's sort of hard to avoid seeing the administration as doing anything other than kind of grasping at straws, having found itself in a pretty difficult position, largely of its own making. And again, this isn't a Europe that is somehow in favor of the Iranian regime. They're really not. They're just not keen to carry the can for a militarily unsalvageable position in terms of the Straits of Hormuz that the administration has created for itself. Yeah, understandably, the president and some of his advisors are pretty annoyed about that. The ceasefire is in progress. It's a fragile 2-week ceasefire. We're about, 6 days into the 2-week period. Negotiations just broke down. I think this is an example of the mosaic doctrine of Iran, where there's not a single point of contact to negotiate with, and as a function of that, it's just imploded. Now our next move is this blockade. So we have 2 amphibious ready groups stationed in the Gulf of Oman. So what are your thoughts about the way that A, the United States can unilaterally execute this blockade, and B, whether NATO countries are going to have to come in to help just for their own interest? Well, the logic for the blockade is clearly that the people advising the administration have identified that one of the things that meant the Iranian regime felt comfortable continuing, at least as long as the US did with open hostilities, was that Iran was still able and was indeed still continuing to export oil and gas itself, despite essentially closing the straits to anybody else who wasn't operating under agreement from the IRGC. And so the logic here would be then that by interdicting any ships that come out of Iranian ports, it cuts off that economic ability for the Iranian side to continue exporting and therefore to continue to receive revenue, and therefore puts more pressure on them. That is true. The problem is it also puts a lot of pressure on the people for whom that oil and gas was being exported from Iran, primarily China and quite a number of countries in the Far East. Now, the logic continues, therefore, that will hopefully, from the US point of view and European point of view, make the Chinese, for example, put pressure on Tehran to make some compromises to agree a ceasefire that is acceptable to the administration. The flip side is it doesn't immediately give the Iranians any incentive to open up the Strait of Hormuz to non-Iranian port origin vessels. So you have this strange situation where, to achieve one of their primary economic objectives, the White House, which is to reopen the free flow of oil, gas, and other, particularly things like helium. There's other critical things that flow through the straits, helium being a very important industrial product, for example, rare earth metal and high-end alloy manufacturing that the US requires for its defense industrial base, among others, a lot of which comes from the Gulf. The Iranians aren't letting that through without paying a toll. Therefore, the US is saying it will interdict all the other traffic that is being allowed through. The problem is up front that will further increase the pressure that the US administration is under economically and that US allies are feeling and therefore trying to transfer onto the US administration from massively increased global oil and gas prices. Because the reason the US wasn't previously interdicting Iranian exports of oil and gas during the active phase of the conflict was because that would even further spike global oil and gas prices, because it would deny Iranian customers in the Far East mostly their oil and gas supplies. And since global supply is ultimately a global market, that would further spike the impact that was already being had on Western customers of Gulf oil and gas exports being blocked, or indeed all GCC exports being blocked. So it's sort of who blinks first. One of the problems during the active phase was that the US was talking about regime change, which, if you're looking for a way to force a government to not compromise, even if they might want to, is a very, very good way of stopping them from compromising. To talk about regime change, because the moment you start saying regime change as one of your core aims, you've made it existential for your opponent in terms of the opposing government, especially in a system like the Iranian, where if these people lose power, they're probably not going to have a very good time individually. The regime change demands sort of fading away, hopefully in the US negotiating strategy here, might increase the effectiveness of pressure that a blockade could put on in terms of economic pressure on the Iranian regime to compromise. The flip side is it doesn't necessarily force the Iranians to compromise faster than it forces the US and its allies and economic partners, because fundamentally the US benefits a lot more from the global economy than Iran does. And if the effect of an essentially joint Iranian blockade through the Straits and US blockade outside the Straits of most oil and gas shipping is devastation in the global economy, that is likely to hit US voters and therefore what the administration cares about. And also US allies, and therefore the amount of pressure being piled on the White House from GCC allies, European allies, South American allies, whoever, allies in the Far East, faster than it is an embattled, essentially pretty existentially challenged IRGC regime who are more likely to feel that they can go to the wall, as it were, because the alternative for them is not some bad press that looks bad during the midterms. It's potentially death. So there's a slightly different kind of risk calculus being played out. If the US had explicitly stated aims going into this operation that were limited, i.e., hard limits on ballistic missile inventory that were enforced by inspections that were significantly lower than Iran had up to that point, been self-limiting around in terms of range brackets, for example, a return to JCPOA, so the Obama-Iran deal type verification of limits on enrichment that were well below those that would give you a rapid breakout to nuclear weapons capability, and hadn't talked about regime change straight up, you might have seen a more successful outcome from a maximum pressure strategy in terms of getting Iranian compromises. But having framed it as regime change and the end of their civilization at various points, you can kind of see how through that maximum pressure approach, the US administration has inadvertently driven the Iranians into an extremely hardline negotiating position. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.